Part 2 of the history of Buick, this time on Talking Vehicles with Joe. Now, in my last video, I started a multi-part series on the history of Buick. And I kind of took you from its inception up through about World War II. Buick was positioned by General Motors to be the step between Oldsmobile and Cadillac. And really, where Buick wound up, or what Buick wound up being, was a vehicle that successful people liked to own, particularly businessmen that didn't want to flaunt their success. Buicks were very well-made cars, luxurious, and had a high level of recognition as a upscale vehicle. But they weren't as ostentatious as Cadillacs were. And businessmen, particularly like doctors, lawyers, accountants, preferred that kind of an image to driving a Cadillac. Now, a lot of times, Buick owners would also own a Cadillac, and maybe the Cadillac was a car that went to the club on the weekend or they drove to church. But the Buick was the car that they used if they were involved in their business. So that's really kind of where Buick wound up being positioned, especially through the 40s, 50s, and beyond. In the 1950s, Buick persisted on using their inline straight 8 engine versus going to a V-type configuration, which most other car companies had done. And up through 1953, they stayed with the straight 8. As a matter of fact, the Buick had to do a couple of interesting things. They had to hinge the hood on the sides instead of the back of the hood, back towards the windshield, so that anybody servicing the engine could get access to the full engine. And Buick hoods were always quite long to accommodate the length of the straight 8 engine. It wasn't until 1954 that they actually adopted the V configuration engine, which affectionately became known as the nail head because of the configuration of the studs that held the heads in place. So Buick, and the other thing that happened that was very interesting was the post-war redesign brought vehicles that were shedding the 4-fender look, where you would see 4 very distinctive fenders that almost looked separate from the body, were separate from the body, were actually attached to the body. The fenders were now becoming more part of the flowing bodywork. Now, when this redesign occurred in the late 1940s, the Buick designers added something that was unique to Buick and really became a very distinctive trademark, let's call it, of Buick for many years. And that is the portholes or ventiports in the front fender. Now, there were lots of reasons that were supposed that these ventiports existed. One of them was that Buick's new automatic transmission called the Dynaflow ran hot and needed extra ventilation. So those ports were put in the fenders to accommodate cooling the Dynaflow. And if you remember, or if you know anything about Buick ventiports, or if you remember, the lesser vehicles, the Special, the Century, the Super, had 3 ventiports. And the Roadmaster had 4 ventiports per side. And the theory there was that the smaller, lighter cars didn't tax the Dynaflow as much, so they didn't need as much cooling as the Roadmaster, the biggest and heaviest one. So there was an extra ventiport for extra cooling. Well, that's not why the ventiports were there. Another theory was that the Buick straight 8, by the time the coolant got from one end of the engine to the other, was quite warm, and they needed extra ventilation in the engine compartment to help keep the engine cool and keep it from overheating. That's not the real reason the ventiports were there either. According to Buick stylists, the ventiports were strictly a styling exercise. They made Buicks distinctive. And The Venaports would actually, because there was 4 on the Roadmaster, distinguish the Roadmaster as the top-end vehicle. And also the trim on the Venaports became a little bit more elaborate as you moved up the scale of the Buick models. So, for example, the Special would have the lowest level of chrome trim, or just a minor amount of chrome trim, and the Roadmaster would have a significant greater amount of chrome trim around the Venaports. And they were strictly there for styling purposes. Now, it's interesting that those Venaports had such an impact and became such a part of the Buick brand that even after they quit being actual holes in the fender in the 1950s, there was some vestige of them or some representation of them on Buicks clear up through the 2000s. The early Buick Encores had a chrome trim plate on the hood that was reminiscent of the Venaports that were in Buicks. So again, we go through the 1950s with Buick playing really kind of second fiddle to Cadillac, at least in my opinion anyway. Second fiddle to Cadillac. But in 1958, Buick did something that was really out of character for them. And frankly, it's amazing that it got through GM brass, that GM brass actually allowed it to happen. They introduced a car called the Limited. The Limited was based on the Roadmaster platform, the Roadmaster chassis and the Roadmaster body style and body trim. But it was ostentatious beyond what Cadillac was doing. It was slathered in chrome. There was chrome everywhere on that car, prodigious amounts of it. Every option that you could think of that you would expect to be on let's say a high-end Cadillac was standard on the Buick Limited. The price tag was above a Cadillac sedan. You could actually pay more for the Buick Limited, or you would actually have to pay more for the Buick Limited than you would for a Cadillac sedan. And Buick was offering a car that was positioned above Cadillac. Now, it didn't top the highest level Cadillac Fleetwood, but certainly the Cadillac sedan. Buick only sold 7,000 of them, and it was a 1-year only exercise. But it's amazing that Buick went that route when their entire persona was that of the alternative to the more ostentatious Cadillac. Although the moniker Limited became something that Buick used in later years to designate a higher trim level of their vehicle. For example, the Electras of the 1960s, which were Electra 225s, when you purchased the higher trim level, instead of Electra 225 became the Electra Limited. And Buick continued with the Limited moniker on up through the 1980s to designate the highest trim level that you could get on a Buick. So let's go back through the late 1950s and 1959 actually. All of a sudden, the very familiar Buick nameplates like Century, Special, Roadmaster were gone. In their place were names like LeSabre and Electra. And matter of fact, the Electra 225 was introduced in 1959, and the Electra 225 was called the Electra 225 because it was 225 inches long. And Buick kind of entered a new era with their model names and the 3-level identification. They had a LeSabre, an Invicta, and an Electra. I think it's very interesting that General Motors at this time not only had steps within the vehicle nameplates that they offered, or steps from the vehicle nameplates that they offered. In other words, you'd step from Chevrolet to Pontiac to Oldsmobile to Buick to Cadillac. But they also had steps within the nameplate. They had different levels of vehicles within the nameplates. And the LeSabre was the entry Buick, the Invicta was the step up, and the Electra was the top of the line Buick. Well, in 1963, Buick introduced a fourth. As a matter of fact, the Buick Tri-Shield, well, I'm getting a little ahead of myself here. I don't want to do that. The Buick Tri-Shield was introduced in 1959 as well, and it represented the 3 levels of Buick vehicles that were available. But in 1963, Buick introduced a fourth vehicle called the Wildcat. The Wildcat appears to me to have been a response to the Chrysler 300. You know, Chrysler and Buick were competitors. They were on the basically the same marketing level. And in 1955, Chrysler introduced the 300, and it became very, very popular for Chrysler. It was really, the automotive journalists at the time designated it the banker's hot rod, because it was a very, very luxurious vehicle. It had the trim of the Imperial and a lot of the interior trim of the New Yorker. So it had a high level of luxury. But the Hemi engine that was in the 300 produced 300 horsepower. That's why it was called the 300. Very, very high horsepower, very high performance car. And it really caught on for Chrysler. A lot of people of substance liked the idea of not only having luxury, but having performance. And in 1963, Buick introduced the Wildcat, which I really believe was kind of their response to the 300. Same formula, higher trim level. Early Wildcats had bucket seats in them, but they had higher level of trim and chrome and amenities, plus the highest performance engine that Buick offered. So we see Buick going through the 1960s with 4 nameplates, even though the Tri-Shield represented 3 nameplates. And through the 1960s, Buick enjoyed success. Now, in 1964, something else interesting happened was that, well, actually, let's run back to 1961, when GM introduced its senior compacts. Suddenly, Buick had a small car to sell, and that was the Buick Special. They brought the Special nameplate back and put this on their senior compact vehicle. It had a 215 cubic inch aluminum V8 and was the upscale version of the GM senior compact. So the junior compact was, of course, the Chevrolet Corvair. The Buick, and if you wanted a higher trim level on the Buick Special, you'd get the Buick Skylark. And up through 1963, the senior compacts sold fair for Buick. They didn't really do as well with them as they had wanted to. And matter of fact, GM didn't do as well with the senior compacts across all brands, Oldsmobile, Pontiac, and Buick, as they wanted to. So in 1964, they introduced a new mid-size line of vehicles. Chevrolet got the Malibu, Pontiac got the Tempest, Oldsmobile got the F85, and Buick got the Special as a new mid-size vehicle. And again, when you bought the Special, if you wanted an up-level trim, you could upgrade it to a Skylark. Now, performance was really becoming a thing. Pontiac took their mid-size Tempest and stuffed their large car engine, their 389 V8, into it and called it the GTO, and it took off like wildfire. Pontiac had projected they would sell 5,000 of them. They wound up selling over 30,000. And the other divisions saw this performance market, this burgeoning performance market, and wanted in on it too. Of course, Chevrolet applied their SS badging to the new Chevelle, the midsize vehicle, the Chevelle. Oldsmobile introduced the 442 onto their F85 platform. And Buick introduced the GS package onto the midsize Special and Skylark package. And the GS package earned you a larger engine, a 400 cubic inch engine, special handling suspension, bucket seats, special other sporty appointments to it. So now we have Buick being a much more full line offering than just the 3 models that they had traditionally offered. They had the compact or the midsize vehicles with the performance variant available. They had 3 full-size cars plus the Wildcat if you wanted full-size performance. And the 1960s were a very, very successful time for Buick. There was a lot of Buicks on the road, and Buick did very well. Okay, this video is starting to get long, so I think I'm going to stop here. The next video we do about Buick, I'll take you from through the 1970s and the 1980s. One thing I did not touch on was the Riviera. I will begin that video with the Riviera that was introduced in 1963. And we'll talk about that and then take you up through the 70s and 80s with Buick. If you like this video, please hit the like button, subscribe, share it with a friend, and make sure that you come back every Friday to catch another video on Talking Vehicles with Joe. Thanks for watching. I really appreciate it. We'll see you next Friday.